Good morning and welcome to everybody. Today we are very pleased to have here with us Professor Gerhard Dilcher. Thank you very much, Professor Dilcher. Gerhard Dilcher is one of the most important scholars, of the most important historians of law of our time, and he taught history of law in Frankfurt am Main, in Germany, for many years, and he was here in our faculty. He was I think 5 years, professore di chiara fama, teaching history of European law or European history of law, it depends. Professor Dilcher is author of many articles and many books. We have some of these books, books on many topics, leges, gentes, and regna, the German law, the history of German law. City law, the history of city and of citizenship, Bürgerrecht and Staatsverfassung. Law and customs, or legal customs, I may be, Norm und Tradition. Professor Dilcher is the editor of Max Weber, and I remember 3 books, but Professor Quaglioni will speak about these books better. 3 books about the beginnings of public law. This was the book for the 80th birthday of Professor Dilcher. Rechtsgeschichte, Geschichtsschreibung, law, history, and writing history. And this is the last book of Professor Dilcher. Professor Dilcher says the last book of my life. I don't know, but about this book we will speak next week. And many other works, many other articles. All these books are very important for scientific debate in Germany and Italy. And so I'm very grateful that he accepted to be here today. I would like to thank Gerhard Dilcher, to thank the doctoral course of Comparative and European Legal Science and its coordinator, Professor Gabriele Fornasari. Professor Fornasari cannot be here today, but he apologizes and greets Gerhard Dilcher and everybody. Many thanks to the Faculty of Law and its staff, and many thanks to all the colleagues here, Professor Quaglioni, Professor Sanatalini, Professor Marchetto, every doctoral students, every doctor, Lucia Bianchin, every doctor, I'm sorry, and every doctoral students, every students of the courses of history of Western legal tradition and the Storia del diritto medievale moderno 1. We are here today, and so I'm very honored to be here, and I think that Professor Quaglioni will say some words about this. Many thanks. Please.
I'd like to thank my colleagues. There is also Claudia Di Fonso today with us, and I see many PhD students. So great day. So let me say just a few things about Professor Dilcher, and above all about our friendship with Professor Dilcher. Professor Dilcher is, it's true, is one of the great masters of European legal history in Europe. And he is a friend. He's a friend to our faculty and to many of us, of course. He is one of my best friends, indeed. We first we met the first time, about 30 years ago. Maybe not 30, but some 28, 29 years ago. First time. In Dordrecht, in the Netherlands, where we both were part of an international team working on a project of the European Science Foundation at the end of the 80s. From that project came this volume, published only in 1996, The Individual in Political Theory and Practice, published in England, in the United Kingdom, and in English by the Oxford University Press, and in France by the Presse Universität de France, le PUF, in French. A very important book for me and for Professor Dilcher and for many of us. In this book, the contribution of Professor Dilcher has this title, The City Community as an Instance in the European Process of Individualization. This topic, the relationship between the individual and the community. The city-state, the empire, the nation state, but also the university as a community. One of the main topics of the great scientific production of Professor Dilcher. From the volume was edited by a good friend of us, Janet Coleman, who taught for many years in London at the London School of Economics, and now she came back to the USA. I know. So I like to remember that the place of our first meeting has a great symbolic value for European history of law and political institutions, Dordrecht, and particularly for parliamentary history, for parliamentary tradition in Europe, because in Dordrecht it was the hall where the representatives of the rebel Dutch provinces against Philip II of Spain got together for the first time in 1573. It's a very, very important and symbolic place in the Netherlands. Since then, there has been an intense scientific partnership. When I was the dean of this faculty, Gerhard Dilcher was appointed professor for clear fame, per chiara fama, as we say in Italy and in Italian. And he taught for 3 years European history of law. His teaching became fundamental to develop a common vision of European legal history between Italy and Germany, trying to overcome a nationalist vision of law. We have already talked about the parochialism of many historians of law, especially in Italy. We tried to overcome this vision. Many other things arose from those meetings. First, a conference on the 12th century renovatio of Christian Europe, a conference held here in Trento, and of which I was responsible together with my colleague Hagen Keller, a good friend of us. of the University of Münster, and a conference in which Professor Dilcher for the first time presented his theory of Frederick Barbarossa, Friedrich Barbarossa's role in the foundation of a European public law. Then the series of 3 scientific conferences that brought to Trento the best of Italian and German legal historiography, and from which those 3 important volumes, the beginnings of the European public law, were born, published by, edited by Professor Dilcher and me, and published by 2 of the major Italian and German publishing houses, Il Mulino and Duncker und Humboldt in Berlin. And again, I'd like to remember my temporary chair at Frankfurt in 2009, which led me to teach at the Max Planck Institute and at the law faculty of the Goethe Universität in the International Research School for Comparative Legal History, and to hold seminars, thanks to Professor Dilcher, in Trier, in Münster, and in Freiburg, in Breisgau. Finally, in the later years, Gerhard Dilcher has been present as an international member of our doctoral school at important initiatives such as the presentation of Professor Dilcher's critical edition of Max Weber doctoral thesis, thesis in history of law, not in sociology. No? Weber was a law historian at the beginnings of his career as a scholar. So I think he never forgot his original vocation of historian. And the seminars held together with his friend Spiros Simitis, another great master of legal studies in Europe. And last year, when we had the honor of attending the seminars held by Gerhard Dilcher in preparation of the book that next week we will present and discuss in this faculty, Die Germanisten und die historische Rechtsschule, bürgerliche Wissenschaft zwischen Romantik, Realismus und Rationalisierung, just published by the Max Planck Institute in Frankfurt. A very important book. So, I think it may be said that our scientific Begegnung, our long scientific partnership, has sensibly changed the perception of the vision of some features of European legal history, moving backward according to Berman's intuition, moving backward the founding moment of Western legal tradition, especially in the dimension of public law. So, thank you so much for coming again to Trento, dear Gerhard, and the floor is yours, of course.
Thank you very much. Buongiorno, good morning to everybody here. I'm very happy to be at Trento, at this university, at this faculty again, and I'm very happy to have this audience here. In Germany, my friends and colleagues wondered very much when I told them that I, as a German professor, am going to Italy to speak about a German king and emperor in English. But it's a new experience for me, and I like it. Well, my topic is Frederick Barbarossa, his renewal of the empire and the revolution of the Western legal tradition in the sense of Burman. I'll speak about many points that were just touched by the lesson of Professor Zendri, but I would like to include it in a special thesis. I speak about the new fundaments of the Western legal tradition. You know the theory of Burman, and we will mainly focus on events in Italy and the role of a German king and emperor, you know, Frederick I, called Barbarossa. The Western European character of this fundamental change is due to the unity of Western Christianity formed by the Latin Roman Church and her history. The position of the Church and of her relation to the secular power was fundamentally changed by what Harold Berman called the Papal Revolution, that is, the reform movement of Pope Gregor VII. You remember this from the lesson of Professor Zendri. But I will not so much focus on the Church and canon law, but more on the relations and the reactions of the secular power, what means Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. Part of it are the new forms of secular law, and we'll look at that. This was the result of this reaction, and so Diego Quaglioni called the 12th century un secolo giuridico. So law is of prominent importance. The emergence of the studium of Justinian Roman law since Irenaeus is intimately connected to these phenomena. But why Frederick Barbarossa? He was, no doubt, the most important emperor since the Ottonian dynasty, before the year 1000. He came to the throne after the troubles of the investiture controversy and after the Concordat of Worms of 1122. Now we had a compromise between Pope and Emperor regarding the nomination and investiture of the bishops in different way for Italy and Germany. Only to remember you. These bishops this way could remain the main pillars of the kingdoms with secular power in their hands. But in northern Italy, the consuls of the city communities had partly seized the government of the citizenries instead of the bishops. So Barbarossa had a totally new platform for his politics. He tried to improve the position of secular power under the titles Renovatio Imperii, renewal of the empire, of the Honor Imperii, the honor, that's the rights of the empire. These concepts stood in opposition to others, the concept of liberty, libertas ecclesia, the liberty of the church, and the liberty of the new city communities. These two powers, the church and the Lombard cities, became the most important adversaries of Emperor Frederick I and also of his grandson Frederick II. We will have this in mind during this lecture. Evidently, the ideas of Barbarossa were based on the history of the Roman Empire, so looking backwards, but they were also directed to forming the future. When we focus on the person of a medieval ruler like Frederick Barbarossa, we must be aware that we know very little about such a person and what he thinks. It's a great distance between us and medieval persons. We know often more about this person surrounding him, who wrote documents and chronicles, the persons of the court. And we can, as historians, analyze the political and social structures and movements of the medieval society in which the king, the emperor, acted and reacted. So the name of Frederick Barbarossa signifies for us not so much an individual, but it is kind of metaphor for a center of political action and of production of political ideas and planning, the court, the intellectuals of the court. But as such, this concept, Frederick Barbarossa, is useful to analyze historical actions and reactions. As you know, Frederick belonged to the dynasty of the Swabian Hohenstaufen. He was elected king of the German kingdom in 1152. As a German king, he was also ruler of the Italian kingdom, the Regnum Langobardorum or Italicum. Finally, to gain the coronation as emperor by the Pope in 1155, he and his army made the traditional march across Italy to Rome in 1154. We'll come back to this. And we'll come back mainly to his second journey to Italy in 1158. But before, we will have a look on the legal structures, on the structures of law in Germany on the one hand, in Germany and Northern Europe is similar, and on the other side in Italy. This is necessary because only this way we can imagine the revolutionary change in legal culture which had place in the 7th century. We have to have a look before and after, and at the center, the actions and reactions of Barbarossa. In all of medieval Europe, we have, in northern especially, we have a culture in generally and especially a legal culture of mixed character, partly literate, based on written texts, supported by a small elite of literati, most of them clerics, clergymen, priests, and especially monks. The monasteries were centers of written culture. They formed also the chancery of the king, and here we can find written laws and documents. On the other hand, the majority of the population was illiterate. They had no schooling in writing and reading, including most of the aristocracy and even the king. The political leading people did not know especially to write, somehow, a little bit to read. The literate culture was based on Latin, the language of the literati. The people spoke the popular language, vernacular, or a Romance or a Germanic dialect. Especially in the north of Europe, literate law experts did almost not exist. But there existed a legal culture based on customary law. Law courts from royal judiciary down to local courts followed the same model. A person of authority presiding a public meeting, including partly all the free male members of the community. So when there was a legal meeting, the community was present. The community of the king, of course, did not include all the people, but mainly the princes, the grands, the high clerics. The person presiding the court, called judge, Richter, could be the king, a count, or a local delegate of the count. He had the power of the ban, the ban that is to order with authority and coercive power. Coercive power is a very important concept. We come back to it. So he could lead the process and promulgate and execute the decision. But the decision itself had to be found by a member of the public assembly, nominated by the person presiding, or found by special lay assessors, the Schöffen or Scabini, a kind of jury. And indeed we find the same model until today in the common law world in England and in the United States as jury court. You know it from the films about American process of law. Then the result of this, the decision, had to be accepted by the consensus of the assembly as right, or eventually rejected. The person who found the decision found it on the basis of his conviction. We're also men, so I have not to say his or her, his conviction of right or wrong. So the material decision was found, recht finden, by illiterate laymen out of the community, who, however, were experienced in the social and legal and political praxis. This way, unwritten customary law was applied in the courts. As Professor Zender mentioned, Germany, I've introduced for this the term Rechtsgewohnheit, not Gewohnheitsrecht, because custom, Gewohnheit, is the basis, and the use is only the use of it is legal, can be law. There were the leges of the Germanic peoples, which were written down in the first period of the medieval period, but they were mostly in the archives. They were not used in the court to look what's the law. No. As a consequence, the whole social tradition, and especially the legal tradition, rested in the collective memory. This is an important concept developed by anthropologists and even by specialists in Old Oriental or Jan Assmann and so weiter. The collective memory as a factor of a culture. Law was a matter mainly of a culture of orality, not of written texts, which needed also a face-to-face communication, also a concept of anthropology developed in Africa and everywhere. And this face-to-face communication indeed had place in the assemblies and the law courts of the medieval period just mentioned. So only the church was really in possess of a literary culture, but as I said, we don't want to focus on the development of canon law, which is a part, but you know about this, and you have to have it in your memory. In Italy, and we are looking mainly on the Regnum Italicum or Longobardum of northern Italy, the situation was a little different. This was mainly the situation in Germany and in the north. The continuity of Latin culture was much stronger. The vernacular was developing out of Latin, the early Italian language, and so Latin was also better understood. And in Italy, there existed also a dense net of old cities of Roman origin, all of them seat of bishops, with a school for clerics and a chancery. Though so in Italy there remained a certain urban culture. Meanwhile, the Roman cities in Germany were kind of castles and marketplaces. Also, in regard of law, the texts of the lex of the Langobards, the Edictus Rotari, I think you spoke about it, and also the orders of the French kings, the Capitularien, were collected and studied in the school of the old capital Pavia. So there was a law school in Italy. From Pavia, a special school of feudal law was transferred to Milan, the new center of northern Italy, where just in the time of Barbarossa, the new book of feudal law, we'll mention it later, the Libri Feodorum, and you know about it, had its origin by the treatise of a consul and expert in feudal law, Hubertus de Orto, about 1150. So the basis of written law and a culture of literacy was much stronger in Italy, even in the first period of the medieval. This Hubertus de Orto is a good example for a man who stands between the two cultures, the culture of customary law and the oral tradition on the one side and the literate legal culture on the other. Hubertus de Orto yet knew the school of Roman law and sent there his son as a student, but he himself had not studied Roman law. He had been a judge and consul at Milan, so he was very experienced in law, and he lived in the world of the city communities that had appropriated the jurisdiction over the citizens. This jurisdictional power, however, was legitimated from below, from the society, from the citizenry, bound together by a collective oath, and primarily not by the ruler, not by the king. This legitimation from below is, seems to me very important as a contraposition to the ruler, the king, with the public power. Most of the bishops and counts in whose hands had been the judiciary before as delegates of the king were now, in the 12th century, integrated into the city communities, and they left their power to the consuls. Such was the situation when Barbarossa came to Italy, the first time, as I mentioned, in 1154, the second time in 1158. The old structure of administration, based on feudal bishops and counts, and on royal palaces and administrative centers in the cities, was broken, and the rights and prerogatives of the crown were neglected because of the long absence of the kings who remained in Germany and had their problems there, and of royal power for a long time. As we saw, the communities of the citizenries had formed an intermediate power as a kind of revolution and taken possession of royal rights and prerogatives. Berman, in his work Law and Revolution, sees this process as a direct consequence of the Papal Revolution, and I agree. So Barbarossa in Italy was confronted by a multitude of cities, partly in rivalry and feud, partly in alliances among them. Meanwhile, in Germany and before in Italy, the city there prevailed larger territories dominated by princes and a feudal aristocracy, a totally different structure. So it was a difficult problem how to make politics and to elevate the honor imperii in form of a renewal of the old splendor of the Roman Empire, of the classical Roman Empire, very far away, of course. Here, it seems to me interesting for us and our problem that an intellectual of the royal court, the Bishop Otto von Freising, in his historiography of the deeds of Barbarossa, described this fundamental change and the difference of the Italian society in the form of government in a short passage very exactly. Not a high aristocracy, he wrote, but consuls elected by the people ruled in the cities, representing the three social groups of capitanei, a certain feudal group, valvasores, lower, and the simple citizens, so that, he wrote, even merchants and craftsmen held high offices in the city, something incredible and horrifying for a cleric of high noble descent. He was the uncle of Barbarossa. So, through his historiographer and member of the court, Otto von Freising, Barbarossa was well informed about the conditions in northern Italy, evidently also about the new legal science. So he invited, even at his first march through Italy, the teachers of the law school at Bologna for an interview with him just in 1154. The famous miracle of Bologna, the new science of law, at that time was a kind of private law school, we can say. The teachers, called magistri or doctores or professores, were only legitimated by the founder of the studium, Irnerius, and by their eminent knowledge of Justinian's law book. After his dialogue with the doctors here at Bologna, Barbarossa evidently understood that the renewal of the empire was possible only with the help of Roman law and of the specialists who knew this law, the professors of the School of Bologna. So Barbarossa, also in this regard, not only about the cities, also in this regard, was well informed when he came to Italy for a second time in 1158. But when he came to Italy this second time, at first he had to besiege and to defeat Milan, because Milan tried to subjugate the surrounding cities and towns like Como, Lodi, and Cremona. A good lesson for Barbarossa about politics in Italy at that time. Then, after that, Barbarossa announced a great public assembly, a diet, not vegetarian diet, but assembly, great assembly. He invited, as usual, the high aristocracy, the bishops and abbots of Italy, but also the new power holders, the consuls of the cities of the Italian kingdom. He knew that without the consuls you couldn't make politics at that time. He himself, of course, was accompanied by many Germans, the members of his court, and his army, including the high feudal bishops, princes, lords, and their knights. In addition to these normal members of a diet, he invited his old friends from Bologna, namely the famous four doctores, Bulgarus, Martinus, Jacobus, and Hugo, mentioned personally in all the chronicles. He called them professores sacrarum legum, of the laws of the Holy Empire, giving to Roman law and to the teachers of this law a kind of spiritual dignity, this way, the Holy Roman Empire. The diet began with important orations and speeches, at first by Barbarossa himself. His speech, of course, in the chronicle of Otto von Freising is styled with mentioning antique writers and philosophers and so. But Barbarossa evidently was a good speaker. then the Archbishop of Milan and others, and this for us is a sign of the oral character of the event. After that, Barbarossa was presiding a tribunal with the professors of Bologna as judges, he in the middle and they around him as the special assembly. This way, Barbarossa acknowledged the Roman law as valid and effective law for the Italians before the Code of Justinian for a long time was not known, and there was only the oral tradition of Roman law and a few manuscripts. Roman law was acknowledged as valid and effective for the Italians, but also as the law of the empire, because he presided as supreme judge. These symbolic and ritual acts at that time are part not only but of politics, but it's a part of constitutional law. The constitution is demonstrated in this assembly in the form of rituals and acts, and a little bit you can see this also today in the British monarchy, where indeed also symbolic acts are the fundament of the constitution. So this way and there is no written constitution in Britain, as you know, so it is evidently connected to the monarchy. After that, Barbarossa came to the most important point, the legislation to re-establish the rights and prerogatives of his realm and of the ruler. Barbarossa argued in his invitation, after having done so much for the right, he says, use of the single persons, that is for civil law, and you know Roman law is civil law, and this way for the liberty of his subjects. We see the concept of liberty used also by Barbarossa. Now he wanted to define the rights. He writes justitia, the justitia of the realm and of the king, the so-called regalia, royalties, royal rights. But before doing that, he wanted to do some other legislation, at first to stabilize public peace. This was in regard of one of the main problems of medieval society. As you know, self-help and feud were seen, especially in Germanic laws, but also in all of the medieval world. Self-help and feud were regarded as legitimate means of a person to defend himself, his family, and his legal position. Legitimate, not illegitimate. So coercive power, you see, was always a problem. It was directed against feud. It had to be directed against feud. This was true in Germany, of course, but also in Italy. There were many feuds among the noble families in the cities. You remind Verona with the families of Romeo and Juliet, and you remember the many towers of noble families within the city walls, not castles outside, but also within the city walls, not only at San Gimignano, but also at Trento and Bologna and so on. But there were not only feuds within the cities, but also in the countryside, even real wars between the city communities, for instance, as we have seen, between Milan and her neighbors. To suppress this form of violence, Barbarossa promulgated at Roncaglia at first an imperial peace statute, a peace of the land. This was a model developed in Germany and France since about 1100. Barbarossa promulgated this peace statute as imperial legislation, but at the same time he ordered that this peace should be sworn by everybody, from duke and count to the single citizen. I would like to remember here the great historian Paolo Prodi, once professor here at Trento and after at Bologna, who called the oath the sacrament of power because it was binding everybody and was to be respected by everybody because the oath included God. The sacrament of power. So this sacrament of power was not only used to form the city community of the citizens with a collective oath, but also to be a fundament of this peace ordered by the king but sworn by the whole population. This form of a collective oath of all the people was at first, as I mentioned, used in Germany because the order of the king alone was not regarded as binding as to exclude the right to have an individual feud. The king could not abolish the right of feud, of self-defense. So Barbarossa transferred this form of self-commitment, typical of a pre-statal society, the medieval, more feudal society, from Germany to Italy. Evidently, he didn't believe in the effectuality of an imperial legislation of his royal command as such. The right of ban was not strong enough to abolish traditional rights as feud and so on. And he was right, because as an Italian chronicle noticed cynically, Milan and Cremona were at war only some months later after this peace statute. Besides the peace statute, Barbarossa promulgated another law of more traditional character, a feudal law statute ordering the relations between lords and vassals more clearly as before, according to the council of the members of the assembly, mostly lords and vassals themselves. So the custom of feudal law in Italy was included in this legislation. Here, Barbarossa insisted on a specific rule, namely that in every oath of fidelity, of fidelitas, there must be an exception in favor of the fidelity towards the emperor. So the emperor was recognized as the head of the feudal hierarchy, and every conspiracy against the emperor was illegal. This is also a characteristic of a pre-statal community built not so much on institutions like the state, but on personal relations, personal bindings by the oath of fealty. This feudal legislation of Barbarossa followed a longer tradition in Italy. The German kings gave generally some feudal laws in Italy. Meanwhile, in Germany, feudal law followed only oral customs and rituals. This Roncaglia feudal statute became especially important, this of Barbarossa, because it was soon integrated into the Libri Feodorum. I mentioned this book of feudal law. This collection of feudal law stood at that time at the beginning of its consolidation, based on the treatises of Hubertus de Orto, who was among the councillors of Barbarossa at the first Roncaglia Diet in 1154. The fact that this feudal legislation was integrated into the text of the Libri Feodorum evidently opened also the door for the integration of the other text of the Roncaglia Diet, as the Libri Feodorum became part of the Corpus Juris as the so-called Decima Collatio. So the whole Libri Feodorum were part of the legal tradition of the school. This means that an important part of medieval constitutional law found its way into the science of Roman law, this by way modernizing Roman law, opening it to the medieval reality, constitutional reality, and opening the discussions of the jurists to medieval constitutional reality, so different from antiquity, from the times of Justinian and so on. I don't know if we make a little interruption.
Yes, a short break.
If you like it.
Certainly.
A little break.
10 minutes.
10 minutes.
10 minutes.
10 minutes pause for iPad.
Yes.
But,